Hi, my name is Noah Meir. I am the CEO of the Charney Forum for New Diplomacy. With us today is Associate Professor for Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, Professor Peter Jones, an expert on security in the Middle East affairs, Track 2 diplomacy, international affairs, Canadian foreign policy. Can you please tell us a bit about your extensive experience in conflict resolution and Track 2 diplomacy?
I've been doing it now for about 25 years in various ways. I began my career in government. I was in the foreign ministry in Canada, and I was involved in negotiating arms control treaties and things like that, dealing with national security, and I had some postings abroad. And at the very end of my time with foreign affairs, I got involved in the Middle East peace process. Canada was asked to be a facilitator of some of the work, so I got involved in that. And then I left government and I went to a research institute in Europe, in Sweden. And I began to gather together groups of people whom I'd met while I'd been an official, because one of the things I noticed in these official discussions was that certain issues couldn't be discussed. Countries didn't want to talk about them. And certain countries wouldn't participate, Iran, Syria, they wouldn't come to these meetings. I began to gather people for unofficial meetings. But in this case, we could discuss the things that we couldn't talk about officially, and we could also invite Iranians and Syrians and others. And it was very productive and very interesting. So I began to hold these kind of meetings, and I didn't realize at the time, but it was called Track 2 diplomacy. And then I became more and more involved and more interested and began thinking about it and researching. And since I've left government, that's become my career, running these kind of dialogues all over the world between Israelis and Palestinians, looking at the possible security arrangements of a two-state solution. It's one of the things that's often discussed. You know, if ever there's going to be a two-state agreement, there have to be security arrangements, but nobody had ever really done a deep dive to what would they look like, how would they work. So we gathered a group of people who, you know, former security officials, former high-ranking people in Israel and Palestine, to look at these issues and consider them. So that's the kind of thing we do, and we produce reports. Unfortunately, this one's not public. It's been given to the government's concern for their consideration, but we're running ones in India and Pakistan. A few years ago, we ran a couple between Iranians and Americans, those kind of things.
I'm very curious, with Israeli newly elected and formed government talking about annexation, what effect does that have on the Track 2 diplomacy and when you talk about two states?
Well, I mean, on Track 2 diplomacy, I mean, I expect in a way there may be more of it in terms of people trying to talk this through and understand it. On the peace process as a whole, I think it would be fairly disastrous. In the sense of, you know, the two-state solution will be very, very difficult to achieve if this goes forward. So I'm hoping that this is something that, you know, Mr. Netanyahu promised his supporters because he had to, but calmer heads will prevail. We'll see.
So if now we are to zoom a bit closer in when we're looking at COVID-19 and change that it has and is creating, when you look at potential implications on diplomacy and on globalization, what do you think those may look like?
At this point, I wonder if the impact will be as lasting as some people think it will. I mean, we went back after the pandemic of 1918 to very active globalized economy and so forth, and we may do again. I mean, I think there will be some impacts. I think a lot will depend on how quickly a vaccine is available, or how, you know, how deep the impact of this is as time goes by. I think diplomacy at some level is always going to require face-to-face interaction. And certainly Track 2 diplomacy, you know, if we're bringing together people to sort of reconsider long-held positions, it really does require that. But I think, you know, we can supplement that with the kind of thing we're doing now. It's not a substitute, but it can certainly be a vehicle to have preliminary discussions. But we're always going to require sort of face-to-face personal interaction. A lot of the real work of Track 2 takes place informally. It takes place, if you think of, you know, a 3 or 4 day meeting, which is the norm. People, they have lunches together, they have dinners together, they go for walks together, they sort of have informal time together as well as the time in the sessions. And that informal time can be extremely important. It can be the place where, you know, ideological barriers get softened and people come to realize that people on the other side are not as horrible as they thought. And on broader questions of globalization, I think we're going to have to rediscover our desire and love for multilateralism. I think that, you know, after the Second World War, a number of institutions were created. Bretton Woods, the UN, and all that kind of thing. And I always liken it to the creation of, if you think in maritime terms, the sea is called the global commons, a sort of an area where everybody meets and everybody can interact. And there's a certain set of rules that allow us to interact and talk to one another and work with one another. And that global commons that was created out of these international institutions after World War II really was tremendously successful for everybody and had a stabilizing impact on the world. And I think people who are opposed to it have been allowed for too long to criticize it without anybody standing up for what its benefits have been and what its benefits are. And I think that, after this crisis, we're going to have to rediscover that. We're going to have people come forward and really be champions of the idea of a set of multilateral institutions and frameworks for collaboration as a kind of as I say, a global commons where we can all meet and work together. I think that's something we really need to rediscover.
Just continue with the implications or potential implications of COVID-19. If we're looking specifically from a geopolitical perspective and we're looking at the Middle East, and I know you just wrote an article about security in the Middle East, but I'm curious to hear if at all you think there's going to be any implications, and if so, what they are.
I'm hoping that what we're going through right now will re-stimulate people to look again at the idea of creating some kind of a Middle Eastern regional security system or regional dialogue system. I mean, the Middle East is unique in the world. It's the only region of the world that doesn't have a regional security cooperation system. Europe has the OSCE, and Africa has the African Union, and Asia has ASEAN, and you go all through the world, all the major regions. There's always a regional dialogue forum for the countries of the region to sit together and sort of work on problems and try and understand each other better. The Middle East is absolutely unique. It doesn't have one of these. So there is a need for this kind of regional dialogue system, really to kind of set the standards, set the norms, to establish the understandings of how regional relations should be done, and to become a framework where countries begin to cooperate and collaborate on things like COVID. I mean, the response of the region could be so much enhanced if countries were able to have a place to cooperate. And if they'd had a few years before this crisis broke out of beginning to establish networks and links and channels for cooperation and discussion. So there's been a lot of work over the years, a lot of it at the Track 2 level, on this question of developing a regional security system in the Middle East. And it's beginning to be discussed again, and not just because of COVID, but because of Syria and the crisis with Iran and all the rest of it. So I would hope that some kind of inclusive regional system in the Middle East will be, one of the results of this, and the sort of determination to try and achieve it will be one of the results of this.
While again, we're still very much in the midst of it, or hopefully we're at the end of the beginning, could you share some thoughts about potential opportunities globally, regionally, that you see as a result of COVID?
Yeah, I'm having been a bureaucrat myself for many years. Bureaucratic systems tend to be rather sort of stuck. They don't think necessarily out of the box, and they need a push. They need a crisis. And so many of the great changes that happened in the world happened as a result of crises. So there is something to it. And we need a post-COVID planning committee. And maybe governments won't be doing this. Maybe it needs to be done in Track 2. But to really begin thinking about what kind of a world do we want to live in. And I spoke a moment ago about, we need to reclaim the global commons. People who've been attacking the idea that multilateralism is actually a benefit, and surrendering, or at least cooperating in terms of your sovereignty is actually a long-term benefit. So we need to think about, for example, if I try to imagine in my mind, a post-COVID planning committee that was sitting around and talking, well, what multilateral structures need to exist, or need to be invented, or need to be further strengthened? And I mean, the obvious one is the WHO and the whole global health pandemic system, planning and sharing information. I mean, I don't think it's done such a terrible job. It could have done better. But the thing about the WHO is it can only do what its members allow it. It has no power. It's only if the Trump people criticize it for having failed to sort of warn the world about what was going on in China, well, it's up to China to tell the WHO what's going on. It's not the WHO's fault. So I think it's a sort of an unfair criticism, but I think some kind of system whereby countries are much more obliged to share information, and there's a stronger mechanism to coordinate these kind of things, recognizing that nations have sovereignty and they're not going to surrender it. But nevertheless, that's the obvious one. But then if you go on from that, I mean, if you look at the environment, mitigating, adapting to climate change, that sort of thing. I mean, there's a whole network of institutions that one can think of that really need to be thought through and strengthened. And I would be thinking about how do we have a new conference? You know, after World War II, the San Francisco Conference founded the UN. How do we have a new San Francisco Conference on some of these issues and use the impetus of COVID to do that? We need to put a new premium on truth. I mean, we are increasingly living in a kind of a post-truth world where people, you know, make up their own facts, right? There's the old saying, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. It's going on in a lot of different places and a lot of different kinds of systems. So I think that another thing that hopefully will come out of COVID is the idea that we will find out when we reach the finish line, when there's a vaccine and people tally up the damage that was done and the number of dead. But as things stand right now, my sense is that those countries which relied on truth have done a little better. And those countries where the leadership was intent on lying have not done so well. And I think hopefully that lesson will be clear and people will learn once again, as they have to learn every so often, every few generations, that truth actually matters. Facts matter.
As you said, there still needs to be informal meetings, and you still, I mean, the face-to-face is very valuable. But what's happened is that what used to be primarily G to G is now between people and less so between government. And what the Charney Forum offers is tailor-made programs for diverse audience. It can be people who are in the public sector, in the private sector, people who are in civil society. But really, we turn mostly to organizations who would like to improve their know-how and their skills to navigate in this new world of information. What you think could be an advantage of the Charney Forum for New Diplomacy as a program that's really a hybrid between academia and a hands-on sort of program?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there are tremendous advantages, and I think the world needs this kind of forum now more than ever. One of the things I find is that the world is lacking in quiet places where people can go and talk and be reflective, and not have to sort of yell at one another and not, you know, pound the desk and defend positions, but more open up to one another and really talk in a kind of a quiet, non-threatening environment where they're not, you know, required to defend a position, but they're more exploring ideas. And I think this kind of a forum is perfect for that. I think one of the things we've seen over the last few years, and again, particularly in the US in the age of Trump, but not just, I mean, in other countries as well, is a kind of an idea that one can retreat to within one's national boundaries and, you know, settle things internally, and the rest of the world doesn't matter so much, and so on. And we now know that doesn't matter. I mean, this pandemic, it doesn't respect any borders. It doesn't respect any ideology. People get sick no matter what kind of government they live under. The kind of a sort of the idea of a forum, a place where people can go and talk and hash through this kind of thing. And I spoke a moment ago about, you know, somewhat facetiously, the post-COVID planning committee. I mean, maybe this could be a forum for some of that to be done electronically and perhaps in person in some ways. I mean, that I'm hopeful that governments would do it, but I'm not sure they will. I worry that no one in government is really sitting back and thinking about, well, what kind of a world is going to come out of this, and what kind of multilateral institutions do we need? So this kind of forum could exactly be the place for that. And I think it has a potential leadership role to play. And I think that's exactly the vision that Zilli Charney and her late husband had when they thought about this kind of diplomacy and this kind of interaction.
When we're talking about people to people, we're talking about, you know, robust civil society, which is so important in order to be able to maintain that. And from the Israeli prism, you have a civil society that's almost 180 from the government. And yet the ones to take the hardest blow is going to be civil society, because they obviously depend on philanthropy and on, you know, just on the cash flow that right now is halted.
No, the other thing that I found, particularly in Canada, but I think it's not just in Canada, in other countries as well, is that in the last 15, 20 years, governments have largely ditched their policy planning capacity. They're much more sort of transactional, you know, get the check out, deliver this program, whatever. And the ability to sit back and think deep thoughts really has atrophied in a terrible way. And I think that it is the case that civil society has to pick that up and has to think these big thoughts. And I have found that, you know, particularly in moments of crisis, governments are looking for new thinking. They're looking for new ways to approach problems. And they don't necessarily have the capacity internally they used to think these things through. So I think it is up to civil society, but particularly a kind of well-informed expert civil society, to sort of sit back and do this kind of thinking that governments can no longer do because they've lost this policy planning capacity. They've let it go. Budget cuts and all the rest of it. So I think that is a kind of informed expert civil society discussion, transnational, transboundary on some of these issues really would be very useful right now.